council tax as it exists today stands on the brink of the most significant upheaval in decades, a transformation that could reshape not only how households contribute to their local authorities but also how millions of people manage their monthly budgets. And while some are watching these developments with hope that long-standing injustices will finally be corrected, others are gripped by the fear that they will be left paying more than ever before, because the truth is that whenever a system so embedded in daily life is threatened with reform or replacement, the consequences ripple through every community, every household, and every individual in ways that few fully anticipate, and the United Kingdom now finds itself in precisely this position as politicians, campaigners, councils, and ordinary residents debate whether the outdated framework of council tax should be adjusted, abolished, or wholly reinvented. With the outcome almost certain to produce both winners and losers across the nation, which is why so many people are anxiously asking themselves where exactly they will stand when the dust eventually settles, for this is not just another technical change to the way local councils raise revenue. It is a potential redrawing of the entire relationship between residents and the state at the level closest to their daily lives. And for pensioners living on fixed incomes, families already squeezed by soaring food, energy, and housing costs, and young homeowners trying desperately to maintain a foothold on the property ladder, the stakes could hardly be higher, because while the very idea of ending council tax can sound appealing in the abstract, the far more difficult question is who will benefit under any replacement scheme and who will find themselves shouldering an even heavier burden, and this is the very reason politicians remain divided, campaigners sound alarms about hidden traps, and residents are left in suspense, for the hard truth is that a headline about the end of council tax conceals an intricate web of potential winners and losers, raising uncomfortable questions about whether homeowners will truly see relief, whether renters will gain a fairer deal, or whether the entire exercise will merely redistribute costs in ways that penalize those already struggling, and this urgency is heightened by the fact that local councils are teetering on the edge of financial collapse while the broader cost of living crisis intensifies, meaning that reform is not a distant prospect but an imminent one, being debated, drafted, and modeled right now in consultations, think tank reports, and government corridors, and once a decision is made there will be no turning back, because every street, every family, every household in the UK will feel its impact. So before anyone celebrates the potential end of council tax, it is vital to grasp the whole picture, for while some may save hundreds or even thousands of pounds annually, others could be blindsided by steep bills that leave them worse off than before. And to understand how we reached this critical moment, it is necessary to revisit the origins of council tax itself, which was introduced in 1993 after the disastrous experiment with the poll tax, a deeply unpopular measure that triggered nationwide protests, riots, and ultimately contributed to the downfall of a prime minister. And at that time the promise was straightforward, that council tax would be a fairer system based on property values that would provide councils with a steady and predictable stream of funding. And indeed, compared with the poll tax, it seemed an improvement, but 3 decades later the cracks had become impossible to ignore. For the property valuations used to place homes into tax bands in England and Scotland still date back to 1991, while in Wales they were last updated in 2003, and in property market terms those years might as well be another era entirely, because house prices in many parts of the country have risen by staggering amounts while in others they have barely shifted, yet the tax bands remain frozen in time, producing glaring inequities whereby, for example, a family in London living in a semi-detached home now worth £800,000 might pay a similar council tax bill to a household in the northeast occupying a terraced property worth £120,000, a 6-fold difference in value not reflected in the charge, and it is this core injustice that has fueled growing calls for reform, though successive governments have repeatedly shied away from the issue because any reform will inevitably create winners and losers, and no party wishes to be accused of hammering pensioners or squeezing the middle class, so instead the problem has been deferred, postponed, and ignored, yet councils themselves are now forcing the matter by declaring financial crises, with Birmingham, Nottingham, Croydon, Thurrock, and others warning of bankruptcy as the rising costs of social care, housing, and children's services outstrip their income, leaving the council tax system looking less like a reliable revenue source and more like a leaking bucket, into which money is poured but never sufficient to meet demand. And so the question of what should replace council tax has become unavoidable, with several scenarios now being considered, including a complete revaluation of all properties to bring tax bands into line with current market values, which on paper would restore fairness by ensuring those in expensive homes pay more and those in cheaper homes pay less, but in practice could produce devastating shocks for households who purchased homes decades ago for modest sums only to discover that their properties are now worth several £100,000, a change that could move them up multiple tax bands overnight and leave pensioners or families on limited incomes facing unaffordable bills. Another proposal is the introduction of a proportional property tax that would abandon the band system entirely and instead charge households a fixed percentage of their property's current market value, with one suggestion being 0.48% annually, which would mean £960 for a home worth £200,000 but £4,800 for one worth £1 million, a system praised for its simplicity and transparency but criticized for threatening those who are asset-rich yet cash-poor, particularly pensioners in high-value areas, while yet another option is a local income tax under which councils would levy a small percentage of residents' earnings, shifting the burden from property values to actual ability to pay. And though supporters argue this is inherently fairer, critics warn it could drive high earners away from certain areas, weaken local economies, and make revenues unpredictable for councils, and in every case it is clear that some households would gain while others would lose, with renters facing a complicated picture since they may not pay council tax directly but landlords could pass on new costs through higher rents, and so the question of who wins and who loses remains central, because families in lower-value homes particularly across the North and Midlands could see their bills fall. Younger people attempting to step onto the housing ladder might also benefit if the weight shifts from property values to income, but homeowners in London, the South East, and other expensive areas could face eye-watering bills, with pensioners who bought modest homes decades ago but now sit on properties worth small fortunes among the hardest hit, while councils themselves simply want reliable income and are likely to welcome any system that boosts their coffers, leaving residents to shoulder the consequences. And here is where politics complicates the picture further, for the government is walking a tightrope, recognizing the need for reform but fearing the backlash from millions of voters, which is why so far official language has been couched in cautious terms like reviews and consultations rather than firm commitments, yet the pressure continues to build as local services deteriorate and public anger grows, making inaction increasingly untenable, and this issue carries immense emotional weight as well as financial impact, because council tax is not just another bill, it is one of the largest monthly expenses households face, forcing pensioners to count every penny, families to juggle endless costs, and renters to absorb rising rents while still demanding that bins be collected, roads repaired, and vulnerable people cared for. And when headlines announce the end of council tax, many feel a surge of hope, imagining relief from one of their heaviest financial burdens. But the reality is far more complicated, for abolishing council tax does not abolish the need for funding, it merely means replacing it with something else, and that something could prove even harsher for certain groups, which is why it is crucial to look beyond the slogans and ask the difficult questions about what each proposed system would mean for individual households, because the future of council tax is being shaped right now in the crucible of policy consultations, think tank proposals, and lobbying by councils desperate for funds, while ordinary residents wait anxiously to learn how they will be affected. And it is entirely plausible that reform will come gradually rather than suddenly, perhaps beginning with pilot schemes in certain regions or partial revaluations before a full national rollout, or with targeted relief for vulnerable groups like pensioners and low-income families to soften the blow. But whatever form it takes, the trajectory is clear. Change is inevitable. The current system is unsustainable, councils are collapsing, and demands for fairness are too loud to ignore, meaning that whether through revaluation, proportional property tax, or local income tax, the days of council tax in its present form are numbered, and this reality raises profound questions about who will emerge better off and who will be left worse off, because some households will indeed save hundreds of pounds a year, while others could face spiraling costs that they cannot possibly afford, and all of us, whether directly or indirectly, will feel the ripple effects. So the essential task now is awareness, urging people not to be misled by simplistic headlines but to examine carefully how each proposal would affect their own circumstances, considering whether they live in high or low-value areas, whether their income is steady or based on savings, and whether they rent or own outright. For these factors will determine whether reform brings celebration or despair, and with time running out and council tax existing on borrowed time, the decision about what replaces it may prove one of the most significant financial changes for UK households in decades. Because this is not merely a policy adjustment but a nationwide shift that will touch every community, ensuring that some save, some pay more, and some are pushed to breaking point, which is why remaining informed and prepared has never been more important, for when it comes to council tax reform the stakes could not be higher and the consequences will be felt for generations.